Demystifying STEM by Amplifying Positive Influences.
Hi again. It's easy to look back on your high school days with rose-colored glasses. For me, it was a time of change, curiosity, and discovery. I asked a lot of important questions when I was in high school, such as what outfit I could wear to graduation, how I could get away with extensions in my hair. And because I went to boarding school, I spent more time than I cared to admit trying to smuggle in snacks from the outside world. Jokes aside, the most important question I asked myself in high school was what I wanted to be. I now know that I should have spent some time thinking about who I wanted to be, and we'll get into why that's important in a little bit. But to the question of what I wanted to be, being Nigerian, the only really acceptable options were to become a doctor, engineer, lawyer, or banker. There was social consensus that these roles made for respectable livings. So I evaluated each one when I got to 11th grade. I quickly ruled out banking and law because frankly, those subjects could not keep my attention. And I knew I wasn't going into the medical field because I'm squeamish at the sight of blood and broken bones, and I absolutely hate needles. So that wasn't going to work. So engineering was left, but then what kind? There were so many options, and I was undecided for some time until December 10th, 2005. Before I explain the significance of this date, let me add some color to my boarding school experience. I attended a boarding school in Lagos, Nigeria, while my family lived in Abuja, Nigeria. So I took many one-hour flights to school and back home in between semesters and during breaks, as did many other boarding school students across the country. On December 10th, 2005, 60 students from Neola Jersey College boarded a flight home for the Christmas holidays, much like I would that year. But only one of those students got to see their family again. Their flight crash landed on arrival in Port Harcourt, Nigeria, killing all 110 on board, except for 2 people. I remember how heart-wrenching a disaster it was, and the pain felt by many of the affected families. I personally was sad, and I was also equally angry. So I followed all the investigative reports, trying to understand how such a thing could happen. The reports brought to light what might have seemed like unrelated issues, but all of which stemmed from a wider set of systemic issues. So I decided I was going to do something about it. And I selected aeronautical engineering as my chosen discipline, with the hopes of one day working in aviation safety. What I didn't know at the time was that I had just had my first encounter with my why. My why being the thing that keeps me most inspired and has driven almost all of my professional decisions. And that is my yearning to make a difference by contributing to building the dream of a better world for everyone, which is what engineers do through problem solving. I wanted a career that would let me have an impact on the lives of others. And somehow becoming an aeronautical engineer specifically was how I was going to do that. Now, you might be thinking the why and the how don't add up, and that's okay. Frankly, looking back, I realized there are some gaps. But to my teenage self, it made sense. And I was determined to see this plan through. I was finally decided, and I told anyone who cared to listen that I was going to be an engineer. Some gave me approving nods, which made me happy. Others had a thing or two to say about engineering. They said engineering was hard. They said it was a man's thing, it wasn't for women. But the most ridiculous of them all was that I would have a hard time getting married because men don't like smart women. I'm still yet to prove that true, but I added it to my list of problems I would solve as an engineer, and I put my future marriage on the line. Fast forward to my first undergraduate class at the University of South Wales. I was one of 3 women in a class of 70 or so, and I met more people who were in awe of the fact that I was an engineering major. And they also echoed how hard it was. But I think it was when a classmate called me the B word after I had successfully answered an engineering mechanics problem that he got wrong that I think the engineering naysayers were right. Now, I've come to appreciate the perspective that he was calling the question itself a B word, but I still think it was a very coincidental choice of words. Anyways, I made it to graduation, but I didn't have an engineering job waiting for me. So after months of looking for one and eventually moving back home, I considered a complete pivot away from engineering. Because at 22 years old, I didn't know how long it was going to take to find a job, and I was eager to get my career started. My parents encouraged me to consider giving engineering a second shot. So I applied to a master's program at Texas A&M University. At Texas A&M, I got acquainted with organizations like the National Society of Black Engineers, also known as NSBE, and the Society of Women Engineers, more commonly known as SWE. In these organizations, I met communities of students who were determined to become engineers and bring their fellow classmates with them. Collectively, we agreed that it was hard, but there was more focus on overcoming those obstacles, which was a stark shift from the earlier perspective of engineering that I had received. And it also made the journey to becoming an employed engineer so much easier. However, for a good part of my time at Texas A&M, I still thought of myself as an aeronautical engineer only. And I sought this out relentlessly. But I was wearing thin as I got to the end of my program, and I still didn't have an internship or any job offers waiting for me. It was happening again. I was about to get my second engineering degree without knowing if I would get the chance to actually practice as an engineer. A friend of mine who knew about my struggle had said to me that he thought I was limiting myself and that I could pretty much do anything I set my mind to. I didn't quite understand what he meant, but his words came together during my time with Texas A&M's Women in Engineering program. I worked part-time for a lady called Shauna, who's one of the most inspiring and influential women I know. She's also one of the funniest, and also the reason I color code my calendar. Through Shauna's programs, I learned the importance of creating a space for women to explore engineering in a way that suits personalized learning styles, skills, and interests. I also learned that it's important for women to discover their strengths through experiential learning. And this specific learning drove a point home one day while I was mentoring the Super Mileage team for the WE program. A new student had just joined the team, and she wasn't sure what aspect of the project she wanted to work on. So I asked her, "What do you like doing? What are you good at?" But before she could answer, I realized I had been looking at this engineering thing in an entirely wrong way. I had stuck to the idea of myself as an aeronautical engineer without much thought as to what my strengths are and to what I can actually do with them. I had defined myself by what I wanted to be instead of who I wanted to be, which was the limitation my friend had pointed out and the question I really should have focused on in high school. So I took this new insight and I ran with it. I began my job hunt in a completely different way. And before I knew it, the interview started rolling in. I got my huge break at an NSBE conference in 2016 in Boston, where I interviewed with a company called EMC, now a Dell Technologies business. And I moved up to Chicago to start work as a systems engineer. So here I was in Chicago. Because SWE and NSBE had been so influential in my life, it was important for me to connect with them when I got here. And that's how I met Melanie and Kim, who were on the executive board for the Chicago NSBE professionals. I volunteered for a number of K through 12 programs, and I noticed a recurring theme amongst the students I had the chance to speak to. These students thought STEM was hard, and becoming a professional engineer was also hard. They did not feel like they had the encouragement or support to pursue an engineering career. And they also thought that business, sports, fashion, entertainment would better suit their interests because they saw more of that in the media. But they were not aware of the role that STEM plays in those industries. So there was a disconnect. And I spent some time explaining how, for example, your favorite athlete is able to perform better because of engineers who use engineering principles to design the best performance-enhancing Nikes. And a fun fact about this, 60% of the track and field athletes at the Tokyo 2020 Olympics who won medals wore Nikes. Shout out to the sports engineers. I also explained how fashion engineers use engineering principles to design the fabrics and textiles you find worn on your favorite R&B artist. One thing I also found curious about these students that I spoke to was the fact that they had also received similar messages that I had on my journey to becoming an engineer. These messages had passed on fear, uncertainty, and disinterest. So without ever attending an engineering 101 class, these students were convinced that engineering was not for them. So I shared my observations with Melanie and Kim, and they told me that Chicago NSBE had been carrying out some research as to why the number of Black and brown engineers graduating and practicing with engineering degrees had for the most part remained stagnant, despite the increasing number of programs that existed to cater and foster interest in STEM. The research showed that most of the students thought that STEM was hard, boring, and only for experts. And that was 75% of them. Research also showed that successful STEM professionals practicing as professional engineers had been championed by either a family member who knew something about STEM or an educator or teacher who equally championed STEM with them. NSBE's research had highlighted the influence and effect of positive influence on STEM education, be it perceived as negative or positive. And this research made me think about some of the positive influences that I've had in my life. I never wanted to play basketball in high school, but I did because of my high school coaches who encouraged me to at least try it. I went on to play in college, to lead teams, and basketball taught me a lot about myself, about leading teams, and it really got me through some tough times. My parents, they encouraged me to give engineering a second shot when I was really ready to give up. My sisters and NSBE family were a huge support for me during graduate school, and still are. Then there was my friend, whose observation of my self-imposed limitation helped me open up the door to all my gifts. And lastly, Shauna's programs really gave me perspective on how personal and nuanced the journey to becoming an engineer is, especially for women. The research made me think about what paths I could have possibly taken had I not had this influence. But more importantly, it prompted NSBE Chicago to ask a couple of questions. What if, when we think about STEM education, we think about amplifying the positive experiences and influences of not just STEM aspirants, but also for anyone who's most influential in their lives? What if you can increase STEM exposure to include parents, aunts, uncles, teachers, mentors, and grandparents too? And what if you can take these two things and use them to break down silos of what STEM is and should be, so that everyone becomes more informed and influential champions for the next generation of STEM professionals? And what if Chicago is a place for this to happen? The answers to these what ifs gave birth to the idea of the experience. The experience is a 67,000 square foot center of STEM innovation, exploration, and innovation. It is a net positive design located in Bronzeville, Chicago. It is a technological wonderland where STEM can be reimagined across communities. It is so named because while we intend to carry out and execute on our research, our key focus really is on each individual's unique experience of STEM. The experience aims to break down any passed on messages of inaccessibility or difficulty in STEM. And it also aims to help individuals redefine their relationship with STEM as who they want to be and not just what they want to be. It is a place for the creation and transfer of a legacy of encouragement and positive influence so that anyone can explore STEM on their own terms, regardless of age, background, or expertise. I advocate for this project because I had often wished for more positive influences of STEM when I was younger. I know now that a career might not always best be approached in a silo. And I know that there are others like me who could learn this sooner rather than later in a reimagined ecosystem that exists to ensure that everyone is able to redefine and discover who they want to be. This project is timely for the next generation of STEM, and Chicago is the best place for this to happen because of Chicago's rich history of innovation, which includes the world's first steel frame skyscraper, the first Ferris wheel, Chicago Deep Dish Pizza. And Chicago was also home to a number of monumental innovators, such as George Carruthers, who created the ultraviolet camera that took Earth's first pictures from space. It was also home to Welton Taylor, who created the test that detects salmonella in our food. And it was also home to Daniel Hale Williams, who carried out the first open heart surgery in Chicago in 1893. So the experience will be right at home in Chicago's rich history of innovation and budding community of STEM enthusiasts. So take a moment to think about what your exposure or experience of STEM has been like, and also think about who could use your positive influence. And consider what the benefits could be when reimagined in an ecosystem that exists to uncover your why, break down silos and limitations, but more so amplify your specific positive influence of STEM. And know that you're in the right city, at the right place, to discover who you would like to be. Thank you.